Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Um, Today we are, as you all scholars know, that we are studying about a portrait of the artist as a young man. So this is the title page of uh, James Joyce novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. We have discussed some of its features in the very introduction of the novel. Let us discuss a few more points to make the introduction of James Joyce and 20th century novelist and novel writers more authentic. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. The 20th century novel. Introduction. Literature of the 20th century refers to world literature producing during the 20th century. The main periods are captured in the bipartite division: modernist literature and postmodern literature, flowering from roughly 1900 to 1940s and 1960 to 1990 respectively, divided as a rule of thumb by World War II. The somewhat malleable term of contemporary literature is usually applied with a post 1960 cutoff point. Technological advances during the 20th century allowed cheaper production of books, resulting in a significant rise in production of popular literature and trivial literature. The 20th century is by no means absolute, and various genres such as detective or science fiction fluctuate between the two. For the most part of the century, mostly ignored by mainstream literary criticism. These genres develop their own establishments and critical awards, such as the Nebula Award since 1965, the British Fantasy Award since 1971, or the Mythopoeic Awards since 1971. In contrast to the earlier writers of the 20th century who glorified and admired the development of the civilization, its achievements and growing urbanization, and who saw the coming future of the golden ages in technological and science progress. Modernist writers had the opposite attitude towards the modern life of society as the years of two world war, years of social and economical crisis and growing social interest proved only that society was lost and was experiencing disintegration. Stagnation, moral and ethical degradation of upper classes. First and of the most part of the society, a bit later, was a main theme of the contemporary art of that time. Economical crisis, social problem, and disappointments in reality caused by the outcomes of the two wars and existing social injustice influenced the consciousness of people and influenced their inner world. In order to understand the situation in the society of the half of the 20th century, one does not have to read contemporary literature, as it is enough to refer to the paintings of Picasso and Delhi in order to see the decline of morals and disillusionment. Different modernist writers proposed various ways to reform society. If Wolfe simply criticized a reserved world of Englishmen in 1920s, mentioning the importance of seeking unity and harmony with each other, then James Joyce, inspired by Irish nationalist movement, was more optimistic in his writings, showing his heroes in progress, developing into the personalities and individuals who change their lives and are ready to change the society. Other works of modernist writers also use the method of personal analysis, description of the inner world, and fragmentation of thoughts to show the reader the urgent social problem from different angles and describe their universal meaning and value. As the works that were discussed show the moral problems of individualism and social alienation among different classes, we can make a conclusion that there was crisis in different spheres of life. Bourgeois mercantile values caused the crisis of family values, crisis of traditional virtues and principles, and many of them seem to be inappropriate in the society full of vices and absurd. Many could not see the way out and considered personal asceticism to be the only solution, like paintings of Riley or the desire of Stephen to become a priest. In reality, the solution was much easier and did not require personal sacrifice. It was enough to turn to each other and make a step towards closer people. Now, next point is the 20th century novel. Though the 19th century tradition of the novel lived on in the world of Arnold Bennett, William Henry Hudson, and John Glassworthy, new writers like Henry James, H. G. Wells, and Joseph Conrad expressed the skepticism and alienation and were to become features of post-Victorian sensibility. World War I shook England to the core as social mores were shaken, so too were artistic conventions. Galsworthy. New writers like Henry James, H. G. Wells, and Joseph Conrad expressed the skepticism and alienation that were to become features of postmodern Victorian sensibility. World War I shook England to the core as social mores were shaken, so too were artistic conventions. The work of war poets like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, the latter killed in the war, as were Rupert Brooke and Isaac Rosenberg, was particularly influential. Ford Madox's landmark tetralogy, Parade, and in perhaps the finest depiction of the war and its effect. The new era called for new forms, typified by the work of Gerard Manley Hopkins, first published in 1918. Equally important was a novel, Ulysses, also published in 1922 by the expatriate Irishman James Joyce. Although his books were controversial because of their freedom of language and content, Joyce's revolution in narrative form, the treatment of time, and nearly all other techniques of the novel made him a master to be studied, but only intermittently copied. Though more conventional in form, the novels of D.H. Lawrence were equally challenging to convention. He was the first to champion both the primitive and the super civilized urges of men and women. The most widely popular writers of the early years of the 20th century was arguably Rudyard Kipling, a highly versatile writer of novels, short stories, and poems, often based on his experiences in British India. To date, the youngest ever receptionist of the Nobel Prize for Literature, Kipling's novels include The Jungle Book, The Man Who Could Be King and Kim, Sensitivity, and Psychological Subtlety mark the superb novels of Virginia Woolf, who, like Dorothy Richardson, experimented with the interior forms of narration. Woolf was the center of the brilliant Bloomsbury Group, which including the novelist E.M. Forster, the biographer Lytton Strachey, and many important English intellectuals of the early 20th century. Aldous Huxley and Evelyn Waugh satirized the group and period, while Catherine Mansfield and Elizabeth Bowman captured their flavor in fiction. Virginia Woolf's novel To the Lighthouse exhibits the fragmentation of human consciousness and perception and shows unrealized desire to see unity and harmony in relation with people. as it is impossible to achieve it in harsh realities. The uniqueness and individuality of every character makes the main problem that is described in the novel. Sorry, the uniqueness and individuality of every character makes the main problem that is described in the novel. For the author, is it is the isolation and alienation of the character from one another and desire and destroy this gap. In order to feel personal emptiness and loneliness, I will suggest not a compromise of all perspectives, but the dissolution of all perspective only. Wolf sees the main social evil in the relations of people in inability to understand their inner world. Wolf tells that without a harmony with oneself, the person cannot build a healthy relationship with his encirclement as he is alienated from others by the burden of his personal problems. The novel To a Lighthouse is about the Ramsay family who lived in a house to the coast of the sea. But as we read the novel, we observe that family members as well as guests only coexist together, and their coexistence cannot be called mutual understanding or some sort of traditional family and friend relations. Mrs. Ramsay often complains on strife division, difference of opinion, prejudices twisted into the very fiber of being. Lily Briscoe feels the knowledge and wisdom in Mrs. Ramsay, but at the same time she lacks confidence as she does not know how to know one thing or another thing about people, sealed as they were. And the novel of Virginia Woolf is simply about talking about all those people out of their rooms, which can be perceived as cells or small worlds, and breaking their limited egocentric outlook in order to create social harmony and healthy atmosphere in relations with each other. The example of Lily Briscoe relationship with her paintings illustrate isolationism and personal gap in the relations between people in the story. Lily paints a world in front of her, standing just in front of the house, and her paintings only reflect the environment she lives in. Her paintings show more than usual images as they reflect the inner world and emotional life of her close people. Nevertheless, Lily is not free as she is afraid of anyone penetrating in the world of her art, as such penetration could destroy her inner world. The reason of such phobia, according to Woolf, lie in the perception of reality by Lily, as we observe through the text that painting provides an alternative reality for Lily, illusion where she escapes from reality and finds shelter from everyday problem. The image of the lighthouse is very symbolic as it shows the isolation of people, their limited outlook, and lack of desire for creating closer relationships. It shows the selfishness and stubborn character through their reluctance to make the first step towards mutual understanding and happiness. But the lighthouse has to break up when Ramsay family reach it at the end of the novel, and to Lily, who is standing on the lawn, it seems to be almost invisible, melted away into a blue haze. Unlike unwilling and stationary characters of Virginia Woolf to the Lighthouse, the hero of James Joyce's novel, A Portrait of the Artist, as a young man, is more active and is developing. Like the characters of the Lighthouse, the main character of Joyce's novel, Stephen is experiencing personal emptiness and alienation as the reality contradiction to his upbringing and his and high moral principle of his education in traditions of Catholic Irishman. He turns from a family boy into a handsome, educated young man who is not able to find place in the bourgeois contradictory world. Financial problems of his family make him to change the place of studying and living not once, and as a result he gets a multi-sided life experience. The situation on the shore of these change his life principles as he watched a dancing young girl and was charmed by her beauty. He understands that it is impossible to reject a human beauty and natural feelings. Doing this, he was resisting his nature and only was causing more harm to himself. Later in the university, he meets a man named Cranley, who becomes his friend and helps him to formulate his own theory about love, life, and art. As we can see, the hero of Joyce's overcomes alienation and finds social harmony in relation with others as he is able to try new things and new experiences and is courage enough to make a first step towards other fighting his fears and submitting his shameful nature. One of the major reasons for such a description of the man in Joyce's novel was the national Irish Renaissance at the beginning of the 20th century and the personal desire of Irishmen to change at least their personal lives for better. The spirit of nationalism and elements of national ideas are obvious in this writing of Joyce's, as he also proposes changes in Irish Catholic traditions, etc. Unlike the heroes of Woolf's writing, Stephen is experiencing different sort of alienation and has different fears as his personal conflict is based on Puritan upbringing, tradition with freedom, loving nature of the personality. It was not created artificially and he is more open to the environment, but that the heroes of Wolf's novel he is just stuck in the way to express his individualism to others. From around 1910, the modernist movement began to influence English literature, while their Victorian predecessors had usually been happy to cater to mainstream middle class taste. 20th century writers such as James Joyce often felt alienated from it, so responded by writing more intellectually challenging works or by pushing the boundaries of acceptable content. Important novelists between the two world wars, including Irish writer James Joyce, alongside English author D.H. Lawrence, Virginia Woolf, E.M. Forster, C.S. Forster, and P.G. Wodehouse. Joyce's complex works, including Ulysses, arguably the most important work of the modernist literature that is referred to as a demonstration and summation of the entire movement. It is an interpretation of Odyssey set in Dublin and culminates in Finnegan's Wake. D.H. Lawrence wrote with understanding about the social life of the lower and middle classes and the personal life of those who could not adapt to the social norms of his time. Sons and Lovers 1913 is widely regarded as his earlier masterpiece. There followed The Rainbow 1915 and its sequel Women in Love 1920. Lawrence attempted to explore human emotions more deeply than his contemporaries and challenge the boundaries of acceptable treatment of sexual issues. Most notably in Lady Chatterley's Lovers 1928. E.M. Forster, A Passage to India 1924, reflected challenges to attempted to explore human emotions more deeply than his contemporary and challenge the boundaries of the acceptable treatment of sexual issues, most notably in Lady Chatterley's 1928. E.M. Forster, A Passage to India 1924, reflected challenges to imperialism, while his earlier works, such as A Room with a Few, uh, Howard with a View, and Howard and examined Edwardian society in England. The popularity of novelists who wrote in a more traditional style, such as Nobel Prize laureate John Galsworthy, whose novels include the Forsyte Saga, and Arnold Bennett, author of The Old Wives' Tale, continued in the interwar period. At the same time, the Georgian poets maintained a more conservative approach to poetry by combining romanticism, sentimental, and hedonism sandwiched between the Victorian era with its strict classicism and modernism and strident rejection of pure asceticism. Novels featuring a gentleman adventurer who were popular between the wars, exemplifying by the series of H.C. Macneill with Bulldog, Drummond 1920, and Leslie Chatteris, whose many books chronicled the adventures of Simon Templar alias the Saint. Aldous Huxley's futuristic novel Brave New World 1932 anticipates development in reproductive technology and sleep learning that combine to change society. The future society is an embodiment of the ideals that form the basis of futurism. James Hilton's Lost Horizon 1933 is best remembered as the origin of Shangri-La, the mythical utopian monastery in the mountains of Tibet. His other notable work is Goodbye, Mr. Chips. Author and playwright Daphne du Maurier wrote The Birds and Don't Look Now. W. Somerset Maugham's most notable work is of human bondage that is a strongly autobiographical and is generally agreed to be his masterpiece novelist. A.J. Cronin often drew on his experiences practicing medicine. The Citadel 1937 was groundbreaking with its treatment of the contentious theme of medical ethics and is credited with laying the foundation of the introduction of the NHS in the UK a decade later. Evelyn Waugh satirized the bright young things of the 1920s and 1930s, notably in The Handful of Dust and Decline and Fall, while the magnum opus Bright Shed, revisited 1945, deals with theology. The Arden group, sometimes called simply the 30s poet, okay, was a group of British and Irish writers active in the 1930s that including W. H. Auden, Louis MacNeice, Cecil Day Lewis, Stephen Spender, Christopher Isherwood, and sometimes Edward Upward and Rex Warner. These are the most difficult in pronunciation, so be very careful while listening and pronouncing such words. Thank you. One of the most significant English writers of this period was George Orwell, an essayist and novelist. Orwell's works are considered among the most important social and political commentaries of the 20th century, dealing with issues such as poverty in the road to vigor, peer totalitarianism in 1984, and animal farm and colonialism and Burmese state. Orwell's works were often semi-autobiographical from the early 1930s to late 1940s. An informal literary discussion group associated with the English faculty at the University of Oxford were the Inkling. Its leading members were the major fantasy novelists C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Lewis is known for his fiction, especially the Screwtape Letters 1942, Chronicles of Narnia, and the Space Trilogy, while Tolkien is best known as the author of The Hobbit 1937, The Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion. Kitchen sink realism or kitchen sink drama is a term coined to describe a British cultural movement which developed in the late 1950s and early 1960s. It used a style of social realism which often depicted the domestic situation of social class Britain to explore social issues and political controversies. In crime fiction, the murder mysteries of Randall and P.D. James are popular. And Anthony Powell's 12 novel cycle of novels of a dance to the music of time is a comic examination of movements and manners, power and positivity in English political culture and military life in the mid 20th century. War novels include Alastair MacLean, thriller The Guns of Navarone, 1957, where Eagle Dares, 1968, and Jack Higgins, The Eagle has landed, 1975. Patrick O'Brien wrote nautical historical novels, notably the Aubrey Matron series featuring the Royal Navy, the first novel being Master and Commander, 1969. Comic novelist Kingsley Amis is best known for his academic style Lucky Jim, 1954. John Wyndham wrote post-apocalyptic science fiction, with his most notable works being The Day of the Triffids, 1951, and The Midwich Cuckoos, 1957. Irish Murdoch's novel that dealt with sexual relationships, morality, and the power of the unconscious, as displayed in Under the Net, 1954. George Langland's The Fly, 1957, is a science fiction short story, while Peter George Red Alert, 1958, is a Cold War thriller. Marvin Peake wrote the Gormenghast series, a trilogy based in Gormenghast Castle. Mikhail Moorcock was the prime instigator of the science fiction new wave in 1964. John Fowles wrote the French Lieutenant Woman in 1969. Now, this is the conclusion of this discussion, that is about 20th century. The 20th century literature. Global war is one of the defining features of the 20th century experience, and the first global war is the subject of one of this period's topic. Representing the Great War, masses of dead bodies strewn upon the ground, plumes of poison gas drifting through the air, hundreds of miles of trenches infested with rats. These are but some of the indelible images that have come to be associated with World War I, 1914 to 1918. It was a war that that unleashed death, loss, and suffering on an unprecedented scale. How did recruiting, posters, painting, memoirs, and memorials represent the war? Was it a heroic occasion comparable to a sporting event eliciting displays of manly valor and courage, or was it a ignominious waste of human life with little gain to show on either side of the conflict, or deserving bitterly ironic treatment? What were the differences between how civilians and soldiers, men and women, painters and poets represented the war? How effective or inadequate were memorials, poems, or memoirs in conveying the enormous scale and horror of war? These are among the issues explored in 20th century literature. Another of the 20th century defining feature is radical artistic experiment, the boundary breaking art. Literature and music of the first decades of the century are the subject of the topic. Modernist experiment. Among the leading aesthetic innovators of this era include such English language writers as Ezra Pound, Wyndham Lewis, and Mina Loy, who also responded to the stimulus and challenge of the European avant-garde with manifestos, poems, plays, and other writings. Another of the defining feature of the 20th century was the emergence of a new nation out of European colonial rule. Among these nations, Ireland was the oldest of British colonies and the first in modern time to fight for independence. Irish writers fashioned new ideas about the Irish nation. It focuses on two periods of crisis when the violent struggle for independence put the greatest pressure on literary attempts to imagine the nation. In the aftermath of the Easter Rising of 1916 and the later outbreak of sectarian violence from 1969 known as the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And the Great War, which took place between 1914 to 1918, changed many aspects of British literature. Literature during the Great War reflects the changing society was undergoing and provided a drastic transition between pre and post war work. Many social, political, and economic shifts occurred during the war. Many of the writers of the time felt the need to speak out against the flaws they saw in their society. Their poetry became an act of dissidence in a terrible time in our world history. Women became key economic supporters in the absence of men, and men suffered the physical and psychological stress of war. Women and men alike turned to writing as a means of emotional outlet. Women had to take on a role that was considered to be a more masculine job. Most women got jobs working in factories in order to provide for their children. Additionally, women were forced to care for their family while the men were off at war. As a result, many women began to speak out, discussing their view on the war and the impact of this was placing on their families. The new style of war allowed soldiers an exorbitant amount of time to ponder the battles which they fought. Writers and poets of the Great War attempted to distinguish how this war was different than anything the world had seen before. Gender issues have been a topic in written literature since ancient times. In the 19th century, at one end of the spectrum was the Victorian Angels of House, which placed women in the position of helpmate, homemaker, and superior social conscience, but which ultimately limited women's option to the realm of home and occasional volunteer work. At the other end was the newly emerging liberated woman who candidly demanded her right to education, suffrage, and a single life, but who was generally treated as an outcast by respectable society and still could not vote, inherit property, or easily cultivate a career. Both figures appeared in and were scrutinized by the literature of the time. In the early 20th century, as the psychoanalytic theories of Sigmund Freud became widely read, literature by and about women took on an interiorized dimension. Many later feminist thinkers considered Freud about ideas about women misogynistic and neurosis than about actual state of women's psyche in literature. Throughout the 20th century, literature by the woman, literature by and about women in Latin American, Caribbean, Asian, and African countries has tended to focus on many of the same issues. In addition to more fundamental question of human rights and effect of colonization and slavery on women. In the modern feminist era, particularly after women earned the right to vote in many Western countries and gained greater access to education and the workplace, literature has concentrated increasingly on women's changing role and continued obstacle to equality. Now, the next point is James Joyce, a biographical sketch, family atmosphere. Uh, James Joyce was born on Feb 2, 1882 in Rutherford, Dublin. Sorry. Literature and music of the first decades of sorry. Which they fought. Writers and poets of the Great War attempted to distinguish how this war was different than anything the world had seen before. Gender issues have been a topic in writing in written literature since ancient times. In the 19th century, at one end of the spectrum was the Victorian angel of the house, which placed women in the position of the helpmate, homemaker, and superior social conscience, but which ultimately limited women's option to the realm of home and occasional volunteer work. At the other end was the newly emerging liberated woman who candidly demanded her right to education, suffrage, and a single life, but who was generally treated as an outcast by respectable society and still could not vote, inherit property, or easily cultivate a career. Both figures appeared in and were scrutinized by literature of the time. In the early 20th century, as the psychoanalytic theories of Sigmund Freud became widely read, literature by and about women took on an interiorized dimension. Many later feminist thinkers considered Freud's ideas about women's misogynistic and claimed that they said more about Freud's own insecurities and neuroses than about the actual state of women's psyche and literature. Throughout the 20th century, literature by and about women in Latin American, Caribbean, Asian, and African countries has tended to focus on many of the same issues in addition to more fundamental questions of human rights and the effects of colonization and slavery on women. In the modern feminist era, particularly often women earned the right to vote in many Western countries and gained greater access to education and the workplace. Literature has concentrated increasingly on women's changing roles and continued obstacle to equality. James Joyce, a family biographical sketch. Family atmosphere. James Joyce was born on 2 Feb 1882 in Rutherford, a Dublin suburb, the eldest child in a family which was to have 15 children in all, of whom 10 survived. His father, John Stanislaus Joyce, was a charming, popular, but extravagant man, resembling in some way the father of the Charles Dickens. William M. Scott states that the home in which Joyce was born was more than comfortable as his father had inherited a moderate amount of wealth. By the time the eldest child was born, the father had spent all the ready cash and had started the process of disposing of his immovable property by mortgaging one of his properties. Here, the outlook of the large family was a bleak one, for the head of the family was temperamentally unsuited to earning a steady living. It was only during the earliest years of his life that Joyce had some glimpse of the fast disappearing comforts of wealth and the ease which it implied. Early education. Joyce had his early education at an exclusive Jesuit school. It was a residential school named Glasgow College, situated in the countryside west of Dublin. Joyce had to be withdrawn from this expensive school when his father lost his position as collector of rates in Dublin. This step was only characteristic of the steady decline of the family whose poverty and wretchedness. It is certain that the degradation of the family left a deep impression on the mind of the child. Higher education. Joyce was indebted to the friendly intervention of the former rector of Clongowes for getting admission as a free student at Belvedere College, which was also run by the Jesuits in 1893. 5 years later, he moved to University College Dublin. He formed some stimulating friendship with both teachers and students during this period of higher education. Mm, he was, however, rather an eccentric student, for he would follow the set course of studies only when it suited his inclination. Much of his real education, it has been said, was derived from his ceaseless exploration of the streets of Dublin, his wide reading in contemporary literature, and of little known books in the National Library. It is recalled that at the university, he distinguished himself by reading a stimulating paper on drama and life before the Liberty and Historical Society, as also by attacking the movement for an Irish literary theatre started by Lady Gregory and W. B. Yeats, a distinction which especially impressed his family was that an article of him on Ibsen was published in the Fortnightly Review, one of the leading literary journals of the day. Escape. Joyce found the atmosphere of poverty and squalor in his family to be insupportable. Each house to which the family shifted was shabbier than the previous one. As William M. Scott remarks, Joyce could never forget that his family was going deeper and deeper into filth and hunger and misery, which for centuries had robbed the country of its energy and creativity. Close as he felt to his family and in his attitude towards them, at least Joyce must be distinguished from his fictional counterpart, Joyce Stephen Dedalus. He finally determined that his only salvation was to leave behind the deadening atmosphere of his homeland and seek his freedom and his fortune on the continent. Joyce in Europe, Joyce got the first opportunity to be out of the stifling atmosphere of his house when he visited France in 1902. He he spent some months of bohemian existence in Paris, but this was terminated by the news that his mother had been taken seriously ill in April 1903. In point of the fact, the mother survived for another 4 months, for more than a year after her death. It has been recorded Joyce remained in Ireland, maintaining himself haphazardly by borrowing, sponging on friends, writing articles, and teaching in a school for some time. He published some poems, also wrote short stories, and began a novel which was to become the source of a portrait of the artist as a young man, that is to say, Stephen Hero. With the passing of time, James Joyce is to feel more and more uneasy and out of place in Dublin. In October 1904, he sailed with Nora Barnacle on his way to Europe, where he was to make a career as a um, Bertils instructor. After that, his visits to Ireland were brief, the last of them taking place in 1912. Under the breaking out of the First World War, he lived and taught in Italy. During the war, he lived in Switzerland after declaring himself to be a neutral. Between the two wars, he lived in Paris. During all this time, Joyce was busy writing, traveling, drinking, quarreling, and talking. His life was on the whole uneventful, except for the birth of two children from his unmarried union with Nora. After 1917, he was greatly troubled by disease of the eye, which compelled him to undergo as many as 11 operations. His last days were saddened by the fact that his daughter suffered attack of mental disease. His financial position was made somewhat secure by the grant of assistance from the British Privy Purse, as well as the generous help of an admirer. Joyce's career as a writer. Joyce's experience as an author was not a happy one. His books were refused by several publishers. The novel Ulysses was published in Paris in 1922 but was banned in England and America. The publication of this novel established Joyce's reputation as a novelist, making him one of the most eminent men of letters in the world. A portrait of the artist as a young man had been published in England in serial form during 1914 to 1915, and books from in 1916. Now these 2 points are very much important. That is when Joyce as a writer reputation began, and the dates about the writing of a portrait of the artist as a young man in book form and in published serial form. Okay, thank you. His last novel, Finnegan Wake, was published in 1939. 15 and Books Farm. In 1916, his last novel, Finnegan Wake, was published. In 1939, the earlier version of the portrait was published after his death. In 1941, Joyce fell with an ulcer and died after an operation. He was then 59. Place in literature. Joyce's literature output is not a large one. He wrote only 3 novels, one collection of short stories, one play, some poetry, which was collected in 2 small volumes, 7 books in all. Yet he occupies a place in 20th century literature, which is second to none. His technique of novel writing has had a deep and pervasive effect on the novelists all over the world. He is not an easy writer to read, but his works are rewarding study, since they are inexhaustibly rich and every repeated reading discloses new interests and values in them. Ulysses has had the greatest literary impact, but the last work, Finnegan Wake, is of greater complexity. It is a characteristic of Joyce's fiction that it has a thematic relationship. Many of the characters and situations begin repeated from book to book. Ulysses continues the story of Stephen from the portrait. In some respect, the story of Joyce is that of his chief character, Stephen, that lasts, especially the career of Joyce as a young man. R. Scott James defends Joyce from the charge of coarseness and obscenity by drawing attention to the fact that he draws his character with great detachment. But if so many of the people guide with so much gusto in his book are coarse, drunken, criminal, hypocritical, hypercritical, self-deceiving, or ridiculous. The author himself, we feel, and psychologically disinterested. He is not in the least concerned about the goodness or the badness, ugliness or beauty of his remarkable world, but merely concerned to show that it is like that. You may take it or leave it. He is a scientist describing the objects revealed by his mind-searching microscope. His joy is in the fact that he is able to see them wriggle, not that they wriggle. And this is where he differs to an important degree from Swift, whom in some respect he is much resembles. Swift knew that he was presenting a caricature, that is to say, an exaggerating of beastliness of the human race. Dresses make her humanity no less beastly, has not the least idea of exaggeration, that for him is exactly what men are like. He shows the caveman himself springing out of the depths of the civilized man, and all the worse because he is civilized. As in the case of D.H. Lawrence, Lady Chatterley's lover, Ulysses also was at first banned as an obscene book, but later the ban was lifted. Now, the next point is James Joyce's major work. Let us begin with the introductory lines. James Joyce was primarily a novelist, but he tried his hand at other form of writing. Also, he wrote some poetry, 3 novels, one collection of short stories, which was published under the name Dubliners, one play modeled on Ibsen named Exiles, and some miscellaneous work such as Epiphanies. His poems were collected in Chamber Music 1907 and another collection published in 1927. His novels are a portrait of the artist as a young man, published in 1916. Ulysses, his most controversial novel, published in 1922, and Finnegan Wake, published in 1939. An earlier version of the portrait entitled Stephen Hero and Epiphanies were published posthumously. A portrait of the artist as a young man. The portrait is based on the first 20 years of Joyce's life, and there are many points in which the novel is very close to the life of the artist. Still, it would not be proper to describe the novel as an autobiography. The novel describes the growth and emancipation of a young artist. R. Scott James described it as the account of the struggle in the mind of a youth sent to study at a Jesuit college with the prospect before him that he may become a priest, and of his subsequent career at the university. The style is swift and direct. There are scraps of realistic conversation which serve to bring the dream down to earth. The prose in few pages become and poetic. We are aware of the tension uh, in the mind of young Stephen Dedalus. The crisis approaching, participated by the vision of a young girl on the seashore, which draws from him an outburst of profane joy. To live, to err, to fall, to triumph, to recreate life out of life. A wild angel had appeared to him, the angel of mortal youth and beauty, and envoy from the fair courts of life to throw open before him in an instant of ecstasy the gates of all the ways of error and glory. Towards the end, he confides in a fellow student that he has lost his faith. He leaves Dublin and goes away to live in Paris. He is not primarily a man who is in revolt against society, because to describe that it would have sufficed for Joyce to use a traditional literary techniques. His concern is not to alter society, but to see it in a truthful way, to express his impression of his society. Joyce was merely to present the spectacle of life through his interior vision, for his vision embraced the interior vision of each of his characters. The novel closes in a way which leads one to expect a sequel, which one gets in the next novel, Ulysses. Ulysses reminds one of Homer in more than its name, for its structure similar to that of Homer's great epic. It is an immense novel of about 800 pages, although it deals only with one day in the life of the hero. Stephen Dedalus of Leopold Bloom and a host of lower and middle class Dublin, whom they see passing the streets and going through their various activities and occupations. The stream of impressions which passes through the mind of each person is dragged to the surface, no matter how muddy it is, how profane or obscene it may seem to be. The artist is committed to depict him as he appeared to him. The spectacle that the books portrays is full of variety. At one time, the impression that we get may be one of youthful vitality and endless argumentation, as for example when Stephen unfolds his theory of Hamlet. Sometimes what we see is an intense ridicule of sentimentalism, which its author regarded as a thing accursed. Lord Tennyson is always referred to as Lon Tennyson, what is infrequent in this spectacle in sublimity and exaltation. It cannot be denied that the spectacle of the exalted is far rarer than that of the profane, obscene, and indeed the filthy. When Joyce looks into the mind and holds up his vision to the mirror to see what Fried was disposed to find the obscene, sexual, and animal everywhere, emerging from the depths. The language of the book is unusual, but it is only at first that it presents difficulty in reading. Joyce believed that ordinary grammatical language is not fitted to the expression of the flux of ideas which exist in the mind of the person. What we get is a succession of images indicated by a single word. Half formed sentences are twisted quotations, and the author aims at presenting the whole of life, both external and as it gushes from the depths of unconscious in all its wild but splendid disorder. Joyce spares no fastidious feelings, holds nothing in reserve. He seems to take pride in the fact that he is presenting a text of life exactly as he has seen it. Even when we may dislike it, we are convinced that it is real beyond question. It is horrible, but it is masterly. The connection with the portrait is obvious in the theme. The artist is how at one with humanity through insight into the psychology of speed, our most intimate faculty in which all men share and have shared In order to assert the timelessness and universality of his apparently modern and specialized work, he has the boldness to present it as an epic, and what is more, the counterpart to the Odyssey, the most ancient of epics. He expects us to bear in mind each successive adventure of the old hero because they are parallel to his episodes, and the correspondence makes his meaning clearer. The relativity, he would admit, may seem obscure, but only because the permanent is adopted to the modern mind. Homer dwells on the adventures and has very little to say about the reactions of the adventure. Generally, a single line is enough. That is why his myth seems to be so localized and dated. Since then, we are beginning to learn that speech, not action, is the token of humanity. Our nature reveals itself in linguistic meandering. Time and place do not matter. 24 hours are enough for the demonstration, and doubling may serve quite well for the scene. Finnegan Wake A.C. Ward points out that the language of Joyce's last novel is absolutely new, much of which can be hardly intelligible to the average mind, distorting sound echoes of sense-making phrases can be caught from time to time, while the whole may perhaps be better considered as a kind of a musical notation for the communication of profundities incommunicable in standard language. Joyce's admired claim that in this work all knowledge is synthesized. The wake of Finnegan, to which the title refers, is little more than the peg for the real theme of the work, which is coextensive with the whole of that life in which Joyce is interested. The subject matter is man or woman born upon them, which expresses humanity in the raw as seen as by the author mostly on the semi or ridiculous side. Men drunken are suspected of crime are in the dock or layers. Judges are respectable, self-righteous person. Women sentimental or desperately unsentimental, but in any case reduced to the lowest common denominator of their sex. I will try to express myself, Stephen said in the portrait, as wholly as I can. To see life fully is an expression used in Finnegan Wake in misquotation of Matthew Arnold. His shunning of the conventional language of literature corresponds to his attitude to that which is expressed conventional surface valuations of life, and especially those of the moralist and who are sentimentalist, are among writers those cry love fables fans who are keen on the pretty common face sort of thing which you beat by Hope Herods. Stephen Hero, the novel published after Joyce's death and now known as Stephen Hero, is only a part of the novel of his name, which was the source of portrait of the artist as a young man, because most of the material was destroyed by the author after completing the portrait. There are many events even in his fragment which are not there in the portrait. For example, the death of Stephen's sister, the existing portion of Stephen Heartbreaks of about 2 years of Stephen's life at the university, and many and may perhaps be more fittingly called a portrait of the young artist than the work which at present possesses the name of the significance. There are 383 pages of the author manuscript which correspond to the last 93 pages of the portrait. In both the versions, Stephen is the same poor, arrogant, solitary, and young. For example, in one version, the hero is invited to write for the college magazine and wants to know whether he would be paid for his contribution, while in the other, he is asked to sign a memorandum for universal peace and asks, will you pay me anything if I sign? I has also been remarked that Stephen Hero records the author's youthful preferences more fully and openly than the portrait. The chief difference between authorial comment in the portrait from start to finish. There is not a single comment or generalization. Every thought, every feeling is particularly Stephen now and then. To be sure, the author reports as author, but he never comment. It was the very spirit of Ibsen himself. Justice wrote in Stephen Hero that was this discern moving behind the impersonal manner of the artist. So again, to be sure, it is the very spirit of Joyce himself that is the sun moving behind the impersonal manner of the artist of the portrait. The change from Stephen Hero to the portrait mirrors the progression from the novel of partition manager to that of the invisible impersonal director. Joseph Prescott finds the chain to typify the evolution of the novel from itself, in which the intervention and of the author has progressively disappeared. In the same way, it was he said in conclusion that Stephen Hero is an absorbing document, straightforward, explicit, and marked by a fullness of statement which Joyce avoided in the portrait. Dubliners. The collection of 15 short stories called Dubliner was published in 1914. Joyce explains that his intention was to present a part of the moral history of his country. Dublin was chosen as the background, he explained, because it appeared to him to be the center of paralysis, which he has tried to present under four of its aspects, namely childhood, adolescence, maturity, and public life. The style he asserted was deliberately made one of the scrupulous meanness. Now this is enough for today, and hope so you like my video. um, Inshallah we will start with some new paragraphs and new details about James Joyce, the writer of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which we are studying nowadays. If you like my videos, then hit the like button below and don't forget to subscribe my channel and share them in your among your friends and fellows and WhatsApp group and so on. With this pray um, that all human beings shall live uh, peacefully in this earth. With this pray, I am going to end my video. Okay, Allah Hafiz. Next we will discuss about its few points in the next video.